Welcome, everybody, to the March MagX, in which James Hamlin will be speaking and Ryan will be the discussion leader. I want to remind you that the April MagX meeting will be, it's always the fourth Tuesday of the month, and it will be on April 25th. And as far as we know, it will be Steve Hill. So Ryan, would you take over now, please?
Okay, thanks, Laura. It's really my pleasure to introduce James Hamlin. He's currently an associate professor at the University of Florida. He completed his bachelor's degree in 2002 in physics at the Washington University in St. Louis. He started doing high pressure work as an undergraduate, and at that time, his first paper was published on superconductivity and magnesium diboride. He was then a graduate student in the same group with Professor Jim Schilling, continuing high pressure work, completed his PhD in 2007. He then came to UC San Diego, where I was a graduate student at the time. That's where we met. We became good friends. And he did his work there with Professor Brian Maple, where he continued high pressure work, especially, I think, in diamond anvil cells, but also got interested in material synthesis, where we connected on the iron pnictide story. It was a very exciting time. And then became an assistant professor at University of Florida in 2012. So I'll just hand it over now, James. Thank you.
Okay, Ryan, thanks very much. Let me just get my screen shared. All right, is that showing up okay?
Looks good.
Okay, great. All right, let me just see if I can get my pointer here. That should be a little better. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk today about some issues that really caused a lot of stress while they were happening, since they were related to retractions, which I think it's fair to say are at least one of our nightmares as scientists. So brief overview here. Let's see, for some reason my slide is not wanting to advance while I've got that spotlight thing on. So, okay, all right. So I'm going to begin by talking about a 2009 article on europium that we retracted over a decade later. And then I'll discuss how this connects to a room temperature superconductor, carbonaceous sulfur hydride. That was, the paper for that was retracted in 2020. And then this sort of led me down a rabbit hole where we found a significant amount of other problematic data that was related to this topic. So then I'll comment briefly on some things I learned. So going back in time to 2009. So one of the last things that my graduate work was focusing on studying superconductivity in elemental solids at ultra high pressure. And so we had done things like show that yttrium can become superconducting at 20 Kelvin under very high pressure. And right at the end of my PhD, we had turned to europium. So europium is an interesting element because at ambient pressure, it's magnetic, but under pressure, you might expect it to become non-magnetic and therefore superconducting. And so all of the plots I'm going to show you today, except for one, are plots of voltage versus temperature. All right, so on the left, we have resistance, which is a voltage, versus temperature. On the right, we have a magnetic susceptibility signal, which again is a voltage versus temperature. So before I left my PhD program, we found that under pressure, europium had these small drops in the resistance, which looked like they might be superconductivity. In a superconductor, the resistance should drop to zero, but these didn't drop to zero, so we needed more data. So after those resistance measurements were done, I moved to San Diego. Takahiro Matsuoka, who I had done some of the early resistance work with, headed back to Japan, and Matthew Debasai, who was a grad student at WashU, sometime later obtained what looked like this very, very beautiful magnetic susceptibility data, where these drops in the susceptibility are indicative of superconductivity. So again, both resistance and susceptibility, we're looking for drops in the voltage that indicate superconductivity. So over 10 years later, another paper was published in Nature, here showing drops at much, much higher temperature. So for europium, we were down at a few Kelvin. Now we're up close to room temperature. And again, on the left here are resistance measurements, on the right, susceptibility measurements. And this was very, very exciting. My previous colleague, Matthew Debesai, was a co-author. This data looked, very close to what I expected it should look like. And I was really excited and happy for it. It was not much later that Jorge Hirsch began to question the CSH paper. And in doing so, he reached out to me. We had met at UCSD and he knew I was familiar with these susceptibility measurements. I told him a lot about the susceptibility measurements. He came to focus on our europium paper. And one of the things he noted was that the susceptibility curves for one of the pressures looked quite similar between europium and CSH. So here are sort of two data sets from two different papers, two different materials, and they look sort of similar. I didn't find this particularly convincing, but based on these plots and some other arguments, he basically alluded to, I'm very sorry about that, pointed to the common author as a potential source of the reason for the similarity. I was rather upset by this because I felt he was basically accusing my colleague of some kind of misconduct or insinuating when there was not much evidence there. But nonetheless, Jim Schilling was able to obtain the europium data, and a student had saved an old computer for some reason and was able to find the old data on that old computer. And so I opened it up to find out what the answer was. So I very quickly began to find problems. So I got a set of 65 raw data files, some Origin Lab files, lab notebook scans. And so here on the right, what I'm showing you are the published data in blue. So the blue data is the same in every one of these plots. The orange data, beginning up here in this panel in the upper left, is what the data should have looked like, what was present in the files. And what I'm doing in this figure is step by step transforming the data that was measured to the data that was presented in the PRL article. So first, you have to scale it to 50% of its size. Then you add a line to this bottom portion. Then you have to trim out this data in the middle. And now you've got to line up this chunk of data with this chunk of data down here. So you shift it down by 60 millikelvin and then down along the y-axis. And that's how this was achieved. So obviously, these are not things that really have a physical justification. I found a more egregious example in another data set. Excuse me, I have a cough that I've had trouble getting rid of. So here, a bunch of different steps similar to the previous one. There was this one piece of data I couldn't explain. And it turned out, so what I did was I took I wrote a code that compared every set of, compared this missing piece of data to every other set of data points in all 65 of those files. And I found that this was simply noise. The published data here was simply noise that had been copied from another temperature region of an unrelated file. So obviously this is completely unjustified. It was a misrepresentation of the data. What was actually happening? So there's obviously some kind of anomaly in this curve. So what was this anomaly? All right, so I'm now going to show you the one plot in the talk that's not a voltage versus temperature plot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot the temperature at which this anomaly occurs versus something else, all right? So here's a phase diagram. So the x-axis is the temperature at which the anomaly occurs. And I have several data points here for europium and a completely different material, beryllium gold. What the y-axis is related to our apparatus. So our apparatus is a diamond anvil cell. There's a membrane here. You apply a small amount of gas pressure to this membrane. And because this area is large and the diamond anvil cell is small, you get an amplification of the pressure. So small pressure here, big pressure here. All right, so this y-axis is the pressure inside the membrane. All right, so each data point is the membrane pressure and the temperature at which the anomaly occurred, and it's plotted over the melting curve of helium. So we're using helium here. When the helium in here at sufficiently high pressure and low temperature, the helium freezes. That causes a small glitch in the pressure in here, and that creates an anomaly in susceptibility or resistance. I give credit to my very talented postdoc, Isaiah Lim, who's looking for a position now, by the way, for discovering this when looking at beryllium gold. He could actually hear it happening from our pressure regulator. That's how he figured it out. Okay, so there was a combination of things in this wrong result on europium. There was an artifact that was misleading, and then there was an effort to manipulate the data to make it look like that artifact was very consistent with superconductivity. So we retracted the article. We found there were problems with the data. Not only that, but we also, one of our co-authors reproduced the measurement without a membrane, found there was no superconductivity there. At that point, we were ready to retract. The editors asked us to have all of the co-authors sign on to the retraction. And we were eager to get the retraction to happen. Our understanding at the time was that if we didn't do that, there would be a long process of a drawn-out investigation. So the strongest statement that we were able to get Matthew Debesai to sign on to was the susceptibility data presented in Figure 2 were not accurately reported. So I feel good about the fact that the retraction was a definitive one. Data wasn't accurately reported. We redid the measurement. It's not superconducting. There's no question. But I wish we could have had a stronger statement, and I wish that Matthew had taken full responsibility in the retraction notice. Okay, so with the europium paper retracted, there was now a push to get the data for the CSH paper. And so the authors eventually published that data in the form of some tens of pages of these low resolution bitmap images of a table. And you'd think this would be difficult, but in an afternoon, I was able to pull out these values using optical character recognition. And what people found when they looked at these initially, Hirsch and then van der Marel and Hirsch found that when you looked carefully at the published data, which is shown in green here, there was this funny structure where you had sort of some kind of jumps in the data that looked like kind of standard digitization of an instrument, but then there were these smooth segments. And I and van der Marel and Hirsch kind of independently figured out that this is a cubic spline. Now, some people, when they saw this, they thought, well, maybe the authors had subtracted a cubic spline background from their data. So with susceptibility data, often you have to subtract a background when you're operating at high pressure. And so maybe they had used a spline as the background. It turns out that since the authors also published what they called the raw data, it was quite clear that this published data was incompatible with the raw data. I think I knew that by the end of February 2022. And again, van der Marel and Hirsch came to the same conclusion independently. So what it looks like is the raw data was somehow based on the published data, which is not what you want to see, and it casts doubt on the published data. Okay, so the outcome is that the paper was retracted due to a non-standard user-defined background procedure. All of the authors disagreed with the decision to retract the article, which is somewhat unusual. Sometime later, In September, this article in Science appeared where it stated another senior member of the collaboration points out the retraction doesn't question the drop in electrical resistance, the most important part of any superconductivity claim. Well, I wasn't particularly happy when I read that because in fact, in February 2022, I had raised concerns about the electrical resistance data. I had asked for the data and I didn't get it. So I said to myself, how can I get this data if the authors don't want to give it up? And at the time I was looking at the plots a lot. I was zooming in on the plots and I noticed that certain plots are stored in a vector graphics format, which means when you zoom in on them, they stay very sharp in contrast to a bitmap that gets blurry. And sometimes my computer was sort of old and slow enough that when I zoomed in, I would actually see the data points get drawn on the screen. And for a split moment, I would see these blue data points behind the yellow ones. And I thought, if that's there, there must be some way you can get at that data. And so is it possible to do that? It turns out that it is. You can read about it in this archive post where I describe the process. The basic gist is you convert the page of the paper to something called a SVG, which is a type of XML file. Inside that XML file are lines like this one down here, which look very complicated. But there are ways that you can parse this. These are basically descriptions of sort of where to draw different lines and what color they should be. And so you can pick out things that have a certain color or things that have, only 4 lines. So there's some kind of square or rectangle, and then you can pull out the data. So on the right is an example of the carbonaceous sulfur hydride CSH resistance measurements that were published in the paper. And then on the left is the data that I was able to extract. And so you can see in this very narrow region down here, we're sort of using conventional digitization processes. You'd never be able to get at all that data. Using this method, you can get all the data points that are being covered up by other data points. And so when I did this, I found that the resistance data had a very similar structure to the susceptibility data. So on the left here is resistance versus temperature, and the inset is a zoom in showing this odd digitization pattern that can be decomposed into a smooth part and a digitized part. So again, this red data is what was published, whereas the blue data, the digitized part, is the kind of data you would expect to obtain from a digital instrument. And it really, the published data doesn't look like that. It looks very much like what was found for the susceptibility. In the case of the susceptibility data, Diaz and Salamat explains that the effect is a consequence of the user-defined background. Of course, for resistance data, there should be no user-defined background, and none was disclosed. So I have not heard this point addressed by the authors, but it looks like something was subtracted from the resistance data, which is not good when you're trying to prove zero resistance. Okay, so I should note that after I did this analysis, future plots of resistance and susceptibility by the authors seem to invariably be published in a raster format where I could not use this extraction method. So I started looking back at some past data by the same groups of authors. And one thing I soon noticed was a very distinct similarity between data on germanium selenium-4 that was published in Ranga Diaz's dissertation and data on manganese sulfur-2 that was published in Physical Review letters. So these magenta lines indicate the similar data sets. There are a lot of similarities here, which I think if you look at them, you'll notice. Here's one example where I extracted the data. And so here's data on manganese sulfur, germanium selenium-4. You see these kind of double wiggles, this glitch at low temperature. If we focus just on the region below 120 Kelvin, these data sets are really remarkably similar. And if you look at all the data sets together, all 3 different pairs of data sets are very similar, which is sort of surprising and hard to understand how that could happen by coincidence. So soon after I sent this to PRL and the authors, Simon Kimber replied to the editors calling for a retraction. And more recently, PRL published an expression of concern. So I had a conversation with Dr. Kimber on the phone, and we started thinking that if this had happened in this case, perhaps there were other examples in the past. And so we started digging through some of the past work from these authors. And one of the examples I found, this is from the dissertation of Ranga Diaz. This is figure 410, figure 510, material data on two different materials at two different pressures that are identical except for a scale factor of 4. And there's some other examples that Dr. Kimber has found, which we can tell you about if you're curious. Okay, so coming into the home stretch, what are the conclusions related to CSH? Well, it looks like the raw data is derived from the published data. It looks like the electrical resistance has been subject to some kind of background subtraction. And it looks like the manganese sulfur 2 data is derived from an earlier study on germanium selenium 4. So you might say, okay, manganese, the CSH paper is retracted. Let's leave it be. So why do we care? Well, these same authors have more recently come out with a claim of room temperature superconductivity at a much lower pressure. And so I think these concerns need to be addressed by the authors head on, hopefully supplying data and clear descriptions of what's been done if they want to reestablish some trust. Okay, so some insights. So there's a whole cottage industry of talking about retractions and problems with publishers that I think is often rather cynical. I haven't become cynical through this process. I think by and large, the people who are involved at all levels are trying to do their best with this very difficult and sensitive topic of scientific conduct and misconduct. I do think we need a culture change to publishing raw data and ideally the scripts and code used to make our plots. One idea is to have a reviewer whose kind of sole charge is to make sure all the data that's required to understand the result has been deposited. And those are hard, but an easy step is just to require graphics be submitted in vector format whenever possible. This is quite simple. And finally, I just think we need to talk to each other more about these issues. So I discovered that many people have dealt with some kind of issue of questionable scientific conduct. And I think by talking about this more openly, we can get better insights than we can by reading a website of guidelines on scientific conduct. So at that point, I'll stop and I'll sort of leave up a reading list for those of you who are interested in learning or reading more about this topic. And thanks very much for the opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you, James. I mean, very, very interesting. I appreciate all that. So I want to open it up for questions now. We have time for people. And Laura and I will be looking for hands up and chat things too. So please
Just break in if you want. That usually works too.
Absolutely. Well, I can. Did you see
one question? I didn't see anybody asking a question, but in thinking about this, I think your claim of having someone look and make sure the data are submitted and the data actually the published data can be derived from the raw data. Is that something that, in your opinion, we can start doing with an AI help?
I think that would maybe someday. I think it would be hard. I mean, I think, perhaps at the very least, having some file names that were consistent with the figures. You say, I've got these set of figures. There should be at least one file for each figure that has some data in it, Yeah.
It was a very, very good talk. Very succinct. Appreciate it.
I see that Roxanne has her hand up. Go ahead.
Oh, Greg, do you want to go first? Oh, now Greg's hands up.
No, go for it, Roxanne. Yep.
As the social scientist, this is fascinating, James, at the MagLab. And my question is, did you get treated differently after the retraction when you went to meetings and with your colleagues? What was that situation like? Completely off topic of probably all of the other questions.
Yeah, well, I think this was all happening sort of during the pandemic, right? So in that sense, and as I had recently had a child, so I wasn't traveling much at that point. I think it's a big concern. I mean, that's of course why nobody wants to have a retraction, because there's the concern that it's going to cast some shadow over their research, which nobody wants, because as scientists, that's what we have to go on, is kind of our reputation for care and results that people can reproduce. So that's why it was so stressful. I think that when one of these things come along, the best thing we can do is try to be open about it.
Greg?
Yeah, I in a related topic to what Roxanne was asking, I just want to congratulate you for your approach in analyzing this and pursuing so doggedly the truth behind these publications. I obviously don't know the feelings of all physicists worldwide, but I know there are a lot of people who really admire what you've done. And I just want to add my congratulations for that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's superb.
Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot. Yeah.
So I see Chris Hendrickson.
Yeah, a fantastic talk. I was wondering about your recommendations for future data, and we're all operating now under a fair data mandate, and it seems to me like that our mandates now would demand that your recommendations be met, and that cast as a fair data mandate. I don't know what the objection could possibly be.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of subtlety in exactly what it means to upload data or raw data, right? So, there's one thing which is uploading the data that was used to make the plot, which in many of these instances would not have revealed problems. For example, in the European paper, if all the data used to make the plot had been uploaded, there'd be no knowledge that there was a problem from that. It's really the uploading the raw data, which is the actual file that the instrument collected. And that's very messy often, right? We all know that our raw data files often have a bunch of junk in them that we have to, we were sitting there at room temperature and we went to lunch and then came back and started taking data or something. But really that raw data is the thing that I think is really needed, although I'm not sure how many people will want to upload that.
I think the other thing that you point out is the scripts or the process. Us getting much better at documenting and having either the software we use, the scripts we've written, whether it's Origin, Igor, MATLAB, whatever we're doing, be part of a permanent record that is associated with that, because that's as important, so you don't have to go through this reverse engineering process.
Right.
And as supervisors, I think it's on us as well to train our students to do that and to be very engaged with how they have done that, and done that in a justifiable way.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yep.
So we have a hand up from Mo. I'm not sure who that is.
It's Mike.
Okay. Got it.
Okay. I have rather two technical questions. You showed the plot where the justification for the superconductivity when you zoomed the zero temperature part, low temperature part, and the resistance is not zero. It has some small offset. For this plot, why is still not evidence of the superconductivity? Superconductivity, there is some still remnants resistance of the wires. which is very low. So, which means even if there is this small offset, why is still is not superconductivity?
Yeah, you're talking about this, which
Next, not this one. I believe about this one, yes.
well, the issue here is not the size of the resistance at low temperature. It's that it became clear that something has been subtracted from this, at least this purple curve. All right, so this analysis of this funny digitization pattern, which is not visible in this plot, but once you are able to get at the underlying data, you find this very strange digitization pattern shown here. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's fair that in high pressure experiments, there may sometimes be a non-zero resistance due to some leakage through the contacts, which have to get through the gasket. I do think that we can do a better job of discussing and highlighting and analyzing the size of that offset and doing our best to understand how big it is or improve our measurement to get it smaller. Comparing to things like the resistance of copper at low temperature, I think we could all do a better job in the high pressure community of doing that.
And thank you. And second question, by investigating a different type of user background subtraction, did you got any idea if some of this subtraction was logical or not? Was any logic behind of this of the applied approaches or?
Well, the situation is that the applied approach has not been described by the authors. If you ask them, they will say it has been described. But if you read their description, it's
yes, and this is my question. So maybe did you find to recover this logic by yourself?
No, all I can say, I think the logic is this. Some data was produced in some manner that we don't know. And when pressed for the raw data, what was supplied was, rather than raw data, it was the data that had been published plus some noise, some kind of strange noisy signal. And so once you know that that's been done, and I think it just means you can't draw any conclusions from the susceptibility data that was published. Or the raw data, because the raw data is not raw data now.
Thank you.
So Lisa has been waiting patiently. So go ahead, Lisa.
I really enjoyed your talk. I'm not a physicist, but in my experience, physicists definitely seem to be way more reluctant to share their raw data compared to other scientific fields. And so my question is, what can institutions like the MagLab do to bring physicists forward and reduce their reluctance to do this?
It's a hard question, because it really is a matter of culture. And my thought that I keep circling back to, which I don't know if it's a good one, but we need to begin to reward publishing data as its own thing, right? So with less emphasis on this highly polished paper that's associated with it. I think all of us in the field have tons of results where we did good work and we just didn't find anything that was exciting enough to go through the effort to write it into a paper. And so I think if we can begin to establish a culture where we take that data and we put it somewhere with a very brief description of what was done, and that that kind of output is counted as part of our output as scientists, that would begin to kind of create this culture of feeling that data publishing is important.
Okay, so I don't see any additional hands up. If I'm missing anyone, please chime in now.
Actually, I have something to say, if I may.
Yes, please.
James, first of all, again, thank you so much for your hard work, dedication, and courage to take on this endeavor. I followed your work on this, never contacted you before, but I want to express that, I mean, you earned immense respect among peers for doing that. And I missed first few minutes, maybe it was there. So apparently there are this handling of data in his PhD thesis, done, I suppose, at Washington State. Were any comments from his PhD advisor? Or how did it happen? Any responsibility of the advisor discussed?
We've passed along this info with, I think I may have even said in my email that I don't expect you to reply right away or anything. I mean, this is a very difficult thing to address that takes some time to look at and come up with a careful response. So I think it's perfectly reasonable and not problematic that there's an acknowledgement, but not any details about it. So I think that's reasonable at this point.
I see that Peter Rasilov has his hand up now.
Yes, mine's still going to be a very brief question. I've thought that another easy step might be to require publishing or including with publication all of the data shown in plots as tabulated and easy for a machine to read, say plain text. Do you think that would also be another worthwhile?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, this is all feeding into as well, efforts at things like machine learning, where having machine readable data would be extremely useful. And so I think there are multiple reasons why it's a good idea to do that. Yeah.
Okay, last call for questions. If not, I'll hand it back over to Laura.
Well, thank you, James. It's been a great talk, and I think we all have a great deal of respect for all that James has done for our field, and we thank you very much. And we want to have you over here in Tallahassee to give some in-person talks on this, okay?
I'd love to. Thanks. Yeah.
And Ryan, thank you for being discussion leader, and yay.